Okay, so good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm just going to say hi to everybody. I hope everybody is well. We're really excited about the webinar that we have got this evening. So I'm just going to allow everybody to just have a moment to join. So let's just give everybody a chance to join. I'm really excited about this evening and really excited to kind of touch base with everybody again and be able to explore these various risk conversations that we enjoy having and being able to hear from subject matter experts like we have this evening and be able to just help us continue to mature and think about different things in terms of what we typically have to deal with on a day-to-day basis as risk professionals. So without further ado, I'm going to get started for this evening. We are really, really pleased to have Andy Farrell joining us, and we're going to be talking about communicating in a crisis. Andy is a fellow of the IIRSM as well as a chartered member of IOSH, and so we are definitely in good hands this evening for sure. He has spent the early part or the previous part of his career within the NHS ambulance service. And I think that all of us can appreciate, I think, when people are working under stressful environments when it comes to literally saving lives, you definitely have to have a good head on you with being able to, deal with a crisis and be able to, adequately respond in a highly stressful situation. And so I really do think that we have somebody that has definitely got the ability to be able to provide us with his experience and be able to help us navigate perhaps some of the challenges that we all face when it comes to dealing with a crisis in our day-to-day jobs. And so I just want to say thank you to Andy. A few just quick housekeeping issues insofar as if you've got any Q&As, if you've got anything that you would like to, if you would like to pop in the chat and we'll try and get to them during the course of the webinar, please, you can use the Q&A function, ask your questions, we will get back to you. We can obviously also look at anything coming through on the chat if there's something from an administrative process as well. So from the 1st of October, just a slight change insofar as the IIRSM will now put the recordings of any of the webinars into their member knowledge portal. So I think, previously they were just available to both members and non-members, but now they will be available to members only in the portal. And so obviously the webinars are free to anybody to join, but there is definitely benefit to signing up to the IIRSM and having access to the different resources and knowledge, information that is there. And so, we'll always encourage everybody to look into that if you haven't done so already. So super looking forward to this evening. Andy, I see it's okay. Julie already turned off my camera, but I'll turn off my mic. I'll hand over to you. And yeah, we can touch base again towards the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. Appreciate that. And thank everybody for joining. Again, that's appreciated. It's nice to know people take an interest. As Cara said, my name's Andy Farrell. I'm a fellow IIRSM, charge member of IOSH and so on and so forth. But I've had a varied career, which includes 12 quite happy years in the ambulance service with the NHS in the UK, working initially on emergency crew, and then in the control room as a control room officer. So I've seen emergencies from the sharp end and from the control end. So I understand what crises are all about, how easy it is to get confused in a crisis and why communication is so important. So let me get the ball rolling. Communicating in a crisis. I made the point there that failure to communicate effectively, that's just going to mean the situation gets worse. You've got to talk, you've got to make decisions, otherwise the crisis just rolls on and on. So we're going to look at a key component in crisis management, which is a big topic in itself, And this is the need for all the parties involved to communicate effectively with each other. And I use the term effectively deliberately. Shouting at people, sending messages nobody understands or doesn't receive, that's not communicating effectively. You've got to make certain that people do understand and can respond and can communicate back with you. So there is a standard for this, ISO 22361, and that defines a crisis. I'm paraphrasing it slightly because being an ISO, it's very wordy. It's an abnormal situation that threatens an organization and which requires a strategic and timely response to protect the organization's viability. Okay, a little bit wordy, but we get the drift. I think there's a better and more useful definition is given by Professor Hussein, I think that's pronounced. My apologies if I've got it wrong, from Norway. A book of 2017, The Crisis Management Cycle. He argued that a crisis, any kind of crisis, has got three components. It's a threat to the organization's essential goals or values. It's a time for decision making is limited by deadlines, and the deadlines can arise in a variety of situations. And also, and crucially, there are unpredictable events linked to the situation. That's one of the real characteristics of an emergency, of a crisis, is you're not certain what's going to happen next. You may not even know what's happened beforehand because you're trying to pick the pieces up, but there's no guarantee that things are going to move as you think they will. So it does make crisis management quite interesting, but a bit strenuous and nerve-wracking sometimes. And also, I want to make the point, when we talk about crisis, because we work in the safety risk management field, we tend to think in terms of personal safety, certainly in the IOSH world, if you like. But it's not just that. Incidents can happen which don't threaten personal safety directly, but which is still a crisis for the organization. And an example here is the recent CrowdStrike software, I'll call it a fiasco, in July 2024. So CrowdStrike, an established cyber security company, issued a routine automatic software update to its customers, standard practice, but there was something wrong with the update. As a result, and this is Microsoft's figure, not mine, an estimated 8.5 million computer systems crashed. They just failed. They got the dreaded Microsoft blue screen. Nothing happened. And that disrupted sectors ranging from aviation and healthcare to finance and retail. So an awful lot of people were disadvantaged and disrupted by this crisis, which didn't do a lot for CrowdStrike's reputation. In fact, they're facing now there's a civil compensation claim from Delta Airlines for losses they've incurred. And I'm sure there'll be more compensation claims to follow. They're under investigation by the US Department of Transportation. And within a matter of weeks of the fiasco happening, the market valuation dropped by over $20 billion. So it doesn't threaten personal safety, but it certainly had an effect on them. So let's think now about what we mean by the term communication. We're going to use it an awful lot. What do we mean by this? Well, 22361 has got a large section on crisis communications, but we need to know what we mean by this term. And I would suggest that for our purposes, we can define communication as the sending and receiving, it's a two-way process, sending and receiving of information between individuals and or groups. And of course, that can happen in a variety of ways: face-to-face, telephone, radio, email, fax. Do people still use fax? Send a letter, whatever. There's all different ways of communicating. But how does this communication actually work? We use the term, we know what it means, but what actually happens? Well, The diagram we've got down here, my thanks to Wikipedia, because I borrowed it from them. And this shows the essentials of a communications process. And this is based on what's called the Shannon-Weaver communications model, which was first developed in the 40s by Bell Telephone. Shannon and Weaver, I think one was a physicist, one was a mathematician, working with Bell, trying to improve what were very crackly telephone lines. The voice only, but they weren't very good. So they came up with this idea of how communication works. And in a simplified form, what you've got is you've got the sender here. And what he's doing, he's encoding. So he's got some information. He wants to convert that into a suitable message format. And that'll depend on the situation itself. But getting the right format, as we'll see later, we'll talk about radios, it is important. So he's going to put the message together and decide how it's going to be sent. Then he sends it via some communications media, which, as I say, could be phone, radio, email, whatever. And that gets to the receiver, the recipient. And their job is to decode it. They unpick the message to find out what it actually means. Now, crucially, it's not enough that they understand what it means. In a crisis, they've got to know what to do with it. Because is that message intended for them to take an action? Or are they going to pass it on to somebody else so that they can take action? If they don't understand that, then the message stops at that point and the crisis is going to get worse. So it's important they understand the message completely. I'll come back to noise a bit later on, but there's a little line here, which hasn't actually got a label on it, but that is actually what they call feedback. And this is the feedback loop, which is crucial. What happens with that is that the receiver who's got the message now gets back to the sender to tell them either, yes, I've got the message and I understand it, or I've got the message and I don't understand it. Can you clarify? What do you mean by this? What's meant by that? And that is important. Then the message process goes through again. A second message comes out and so on. It's a continuous loop. If you don't have that feedback, then what's happening is you're sending out a message and you're just assuming it's landing in the right place and it's being actioned. And that can be, in a crisis, that could be a dangerous approach to take. You need to find out what is going on. Do they understand? Have they got the message? That's important. So that's the basic communications process. But what else can go wrong with it? Let's have a quick look at that. Whoops, move the slides around. So typical issues, we're talking here about routine communications. What can go wrong? Well, first of all, does the sender actually understand what's going on? There is, for those of you who follow Rudyard Kipling, the poet, there is a version of one of his very famous poems was that if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs, in his version, you'll be a man. The more cynical version is if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs, you've got no idea what's happening. And that can be a situation. The sender doesn't know what's going on. So he can't send a message. He's got no idea. Or he doesn't encode it properly. So maybe he's an engineer who uses jargon, engineering terms, but he's sending that to somebody in general management who doesn't understand engineering. And so the message doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have the right impact. So the message has got to be put together properly. The noise, which I mentioned, that's the disruption you can get on the channels. So that could be a clumsy use of language, an email failing to send, radio interference, message gets forgotten about, whatever. Anything that gets in the way of the communication is classed as noise. And then the other end of the system, you've got the receiver. Can they decode the message properly? Do they understand the jargon, for example? Or do they appreciate its importance? Because if they don't and think that's nothing to do with me, the message stops at that point, and that's not particularly helpful. Now, what can go wrong in a crisis? Well, in a crisis, as Poseidon said, you've got short time scales and unpredictable events, and that's quite a powerful mixture. But you've also got potentially lots of different people, maybe spread over different sites, with things developing all the time. So you've got the high chance that communication errors will occur. It's going to be higher than in a normal situation. You've also got the lack of experience that people may have in crises. When I spent 12 years in the service, I'm fairly used to handling an emergency. For somebody who's never been faced with one before, it can be quite daunting. So that can affect the way they communicate. And you've also got these short time scales that can put pressure on people to make a decision without really thinking about it, just to try and get rid of the problem. So that can lead to errors. So a crisis can generate an awful lot of problems because of the sheer structure of a crisis. It's also important to remember that you can have more than one crisis at a time. Now, that's a bit melodramatic, maybe. It's a bit doom laden, but it's true. You can have more than one crisis at a time. It's something you rapidly learn as an ambulance controller. You've got a major incident, you need a lot of vehicles to get to it, but you can't send everybody. Because just because that crisis is happening does not mean that you're not going to get more road accidents, more heart attacks, more house fires. They're going to happen anyway. And you've got to have somebody available to go along and deal with them. So you've got to be careful how you marshal your resources. You could have more than one crisis at a time. And what I'm going to give you now is a classic example. It can happen with a major event. So the situation was January 82. There'd been a blizzard in Washington, not unusual. And it'd been a horrendous day, and people all decided to go home early. They'd had enough. The streets were blocked with snow and ice. So now the traffic is gridlocked trying to get out of Washington. Everybody's going home. Not far away, you've got Washington National Airport, and the Boeing 737 airliner took off from Washington en route to its destination. Now, fortunately, there'd been a mistake made and the wings weren't properly de-iced. So the aircraft couldn't fly properly. But they only found out when it took off. It failed to gain height, it stalled because it was going too slow, and it dropped. And it crashed onto the 14th Street Bridge over the Potomac River. So that was bad enough. It hit a bridge crowded with cars. But then it bounced off the bridge, went into the river, which was frozen over, and smashed through the ice. It had 74 passengers and 5 crew on board, and of that, only 4 passengers and 1 crew member survived the crash. And a lot of those fatalities were due to immersion in the icy water, because there was a tremendous, really difficult job to get them out. They couldn't get boats near because the river was frozen. So good enough, Washington Emergency Services kicked into action. Fire service and ambulance, which are link services, they all responded. They had a tremendous job getting there. The reports of fire engines driving down the pavement to get around the traffic, but they got there and they were dealing with it. And then 30 minutes later, it all went worse. Because just then, 30 minutes later, and about 5 kilometers away on the Metro Underground line, there was a crash. There was a passenger train, about 1,300 people on board. Remember, everybody's going home. About 1,300 on board. It left the track for some reason and smashed into a wall. It actually demolished one of the carriages. It's known there were 3 fatalities, there were 25 people injured, and some people were trapped in the wreckage for hours. So now it's a second major incident. Metro Emergency Control Room rang the ambulance dispatcher, the ambulance control room, to let them know we have a major incident. And this is actually a quote from the official report. And it's not a professional comment, but it's certainly human. It sums the situation up. The controller's response was, Oh no, you must be joking. Because he'd already got one major incident running, now he had a second. And it's not a situation where you can say, yeah, can you hang on? I'll ring you back tomorrow, or will next Tuesday do? You've got to deal with it as it comes. And that's the nature of a crisis. You can't stop it. As it's developing, it will develop. He had to deal with it. Good enough. They dealt with it very, very well. They handled both incidents. Uh, and did a good job of it. But it makes the point that just because you've got one crisis, it doesn't mean you're not going to get another. So we've seen that crises, they can be fast moving, they can be unpredictable, they can be dynamic. And so your communication systems need to be what they call resilient. And the UK government, they define this resilience as the ability to absorb or mitigate the effects of disruptive events. So your communications have got to keep pace with what's going on because communications are vital to managing any situation. So your obvious communication channel would be the mobile phone because everybody carries mobile phones. Okay. But there are things to think about when you're planning, as management have to do, when you're planning for crises. So you've got an idea how you're going to deal with them. Think about communications because the mobile phone, although obvious, may not always be the best solution. There are problems. For a start, mobile phones are battery operated. That's why they're mobile. So you've got to carry either spare batteries. In the olden days, you could put new batteries in. Newer things like iPhones, you can't do that, but you can get small power packs, power units, what they call them, which you can take with you. They're like spare batteries, rechargeable batteries, but you need to have some of those with you or have access to a rapid charger, which means access to a mains power supply. May not always be possible, depending where you are. If the mains power supply is out, then you can't recharge your batteries. So you've got to think about power consumption. Also, if you're using the mobile phone on a general public network, which is how it's going to work, if you've got an incident which involves the general public, how are they going to react? They may start using the phone to ring friends, relatives, whatever, to check other people are okay. And that can overload the phone system, the increased radio phone traffic. An example of that, again, this is a UK example, but in July 2005, there were a series of coordinated terrorist attacks in London, bombing attacks. There were 3 bombs were set off on tube trains, the underground system. And within minutes, there was a 4th bomb was detonated on board a bus. So you've got 4 fairly close incidents in the same city happening more or less simultaneously, but it's all in the public sector. The government reckon from the official reports that the number of mobile calls that were made immediately after the incident went up by a factor of 3, which is understandable. People are ringing to find out our relative's okay. Did somebody get home? Is he back in the office or whatever? And you can understand that, but it did overload the system. There were comments in the press about the system collapsing. The systems didn't collapse, but they were overloaded. They were well above capacity. As an example of that, text messages were being sent, and they were being delayed from delivery for anything from 1.5 to 2.5 hours before they arrived. Normally a text within a couple of minutes. No, not in this case. 1.5 to 2.5 minutes. Okay, if it's general public, it's worrying during that time. You're trying to find out if somebody's safe. You're waiting for the message to confirm they're safe. But if you're trying to manage a crisis and it's taking you 2.5 hours to make contact with somebody, that's not very helpful. So mobile phones have a use, but they do have problems. And also, of course, this slowed down the text. That again is another example of noise in the communication system. So what's the alternative? Well, radio systems. They're quite commonly used in industry. Handheld portable units, they're quite cheap and effective and they work. Can you use that instead of phones? Well, yeah, you can. But they still have the problem of batteries. So the user is going to carry spare batteries with them. Also, they do require training. Um, you need to be trained how to use a radio correctly because it's essentially radio discipline. We mentioned previously about the sender encoding his message. Think about it, package it, and send it. And the same applies certainly to radios. There is nothing worse than somebody on the radio who doesn't quite know what they're talking about and is trying to make it up as they go along. The difficulty with the radio is in most cases, they're what they call simplex systems. They only have one channel. So if somebody's transmitting, nobody else can talk. If they try it, the messages interact and they're totally garbled. Nobody can understand a word. So one person talking is blocking everybody else. If they are talking and trying to make their mind up what they meant, oh, there's a thing, there's a fire down, the building around the corner, the yellow building, the big red roof on it. Well, round the corner from that, that's not what you need. Think about what you're going to say before you say it, and then you give the location. It's building 4, Avenue 2. Now people know what you're talking about. Clear and crisp. But that only comes with practice and training. The final point with radios is because they're general commercial radios, the channels can be monitored by anybody using a scanner. And that would, of course, include the press. So when you're using a radio, you have to be aware that people can be listening in. So don't give confidential information like names, addresses, casualties, whatever. What you need to do, if you've got to pass that kind of information, radio the person concerned, the manager, whoever, say, right, I've got information for you. I'll ring you. And then you pass the message by phone. So you're splitting the messages across all the systems, spreading the load, as it were. Okay, well, there's a lot more we talk about communication systems, but we haven't got the time for that. But the main things to remember that there are options potentially. One possible solution, but it's expensive, is the use of satellite phones. Of course, you need to have a satellite phone at both ends, but they will operate outside the normal cellular system because they work direct via a satellite. So they don't use the normal cell phone system at all. So if that fails or is overloaded, it doesn't affect them in the least. You can also try vehicle-mounted radio systems because that gets around the problem of power because they draw power from the vehicle itself. And also they have the advantage, they tend to produce a stronger signal than a little handheld radio will do. So they can work in more difficult terrain. But you still got the problem that the messages can be monitored. But regardless of what the system you're using, whether it's mobile phone, radio, cell phone, whatever, make certain that you've got sufficient people available to handle the information coming in. There've got to be sufficient call handlers, otherwise nothing's going to happen. So in the event of a crisis, you need a communications team to take the call. And again, this has got to be planned beforehand as part of your critical plan. So they've got to have the resources to handle this. Laptops, telephone, handsets, sockets to plug into, and so on. Their job as the communications team, as call handlers, is to handle calls. Simple as that. So they take the call coming in, they make a record of it. That's important. And then they route the call to the correct team or the manager or whoever and let them deal with it. It's only very rarely will the call handler actually make decisions. And that might be to answer a simple question like, is the duty manager with you in that office? Yes or no? And that's, they can deal with that and then move on. The danger is if the call handler trying to be helpful starts to get involved in the call, starts to respond to them, then it takes up their time. You can imagine the situation. Somebody rings, is the Land Rover coming down with the spare parts? I don't know. I'll ring engineering and check. Hold the line. I'll be back to you in a minute. That's great. That call has been dealt with excellently. Perfect. But what about everybody else? Because while the operator is talking to maintenance or whoever to find out who's got the Land Rover and when's it leaving, there are other calls backing up which aren't being answered. So the system's in danger of failure. They've got to take calls and process them. That call should be sent straight across. I'll pass the call to engineering. They'll get back to you. Let them work it out. And you move on to your next call. But if they start responding to calls, then you are very rapidly going to run out of call handlers. Now, why do we have information? We worked out what it is. We worked out essentially how it works. Well, what is the point? Well, the whole point of communicating in a crisis is to facilitate making decisions. There's no point just talking about it. You've got to do something. You've got to decide on an action. So decision making is crucial, but often it's based on limited information in a dynamic, fast changing environment. So critical decision making, it's a topic I'm quite interested in. In fact, I was asked some time ago by the Irish National Ambulance Service, by their college, to develop courses and present courses for paramedics and for their officers on critical decision making. And I did a series of presentations on that very topic because they're dealing with critical information, they're dealing with life saving. And it was interesting to research it, to talk to them, to get their feedback on how they manage crises. It's an interesting subject, but it's a topic for another day, unfortunately, much I'd like to talk about it. But let's just think of one of the potential side effects that this decision making can give rise to, and that's known as analysis paralysis. Sounds weird. What do we mean by that? Well, we've seen that crises need people to react quickly because of fast changing information. And in most cases, this situation is going to be totally abnormal. It's outside their normal sphere of operations. They may never have been involved in a crisis before, and all of a sudden they're dropped into it and they're struggling to decide what to do. So managers can struggle. They're human. They can struggle. They're trying to make decisions. And the thing is, they realize that these decisions can be crucial. Lives can be lost if they get some things wrong. And that can make people reluctant to do anything. They don't want to make the decision. They're trying to get away from it, find an excuse not to make a decision. And so you can adopt what you might call a wait and see strategy. And it sounds plausible. Well, let's just get some more information. Well, let's just see how that develops. Well, I'm waiting to hear back from so-and-so. What they're doing is they're waiting for fresh information, which will probably never arise, which will then give them the solution they need, or maybe the situation will simply resolve itself. It's stopping a crisis. But they're basically waiting on the sidelines, trying not to make a decision because they're concerned. They're frightened about the consequences. I can understand it. But as a manager, sometimes you've got to make a decision. It's a poor strategy. There's another reason why you can get analysis paralysis, and that is down to the pure complexity of the situation. You've got a lot of things happening at once. It's dynamic. And the problem is some people can overthink it. And so you're trying to juggle one solution with another, and how will that affect that? How will it affect that? And so, and they don't know what to do next because they can't find a path through all these different problems, find a solution that works. So how can you deal with it? Well, regular practice, but you don't mean you go out causing crises. But if you've got desktop simulations are very, very powerful. They would normally run about 3 to 4 hours, say an afternoon, where you simulate on a desktop, you talk through how you deal with something. And that gives people a chance to practice decision making, to think about strategies, to test them, to see if they like to work or not. And if they make decisions, if they make mistakes, that's fine. Nobody's going to get hurt. It doesn't cost you anything. It's far better to make the mistakes in the training room than to make them actually out in the real situation. But having tried, it takes some of the fear out of the situation. The ambulance service certainly was very, very, and still is, very keen on these dynamic training, scenario building. We started off learning how to deal with one particular kind of injury. We ended up at the end of the course not deciding which injury to deal with, but which casualty to deal with, which meant that when we did actually go out on the road, as we say, then we had an idea what was happening. We had an idea what to do next. It was still frightening in a way. I still remember dealing with my first cardiac arrest. It's frightening, but you know what to do. You've simulated it. You've got an idea of how things are going to work. So desktop simulations are very, very good. But shortcut to deal with analysis paralysis. If the stress is building, just stand back a minute. Just take a deep breath, close your eyes, and think. Just let the world pass by for a second. Gather your thoughts. What are you trying to do? What have you got? Where are you going? And that allows you to settle down and then start again, rather than let the momentum build up and you lose control. But be flexible. Don't overthink. Accept compromise. Remember, I said one of the problems with analysis paralysis is trying to juggle all the different scenarios so you get one solution that matches everything. You'll never do it. So you go for a compromise solution. You amend it as the situation develops, but at least you're making some inroads into dealing with the crisis. You have to accept, and for some people this is difficult, you have to accept that perfection is rarely achievable. But if you're waiting for it, you've dropped into analysis paralysis. A far better view, in my view, is rather than trying to fight against the tide, go with the tide. To some extent, let the crisis carry you along and fix it while you're running. Don't try and stand there and stop the tide, because it won't work. So accept compromise and be prepared to keep changing your mind and keep amending solutions as the situation develops, which it will do. But there are ways around analysis paralysis. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about, we're doing well on time, that's good, is maintaining records. Okay, this is the boring stuff, but actually it's crucial to maintain records. You need to keep vital, accurate, detailed records in real time of what's happening. So you have what we call incident logs. So there's different ways of doing it, but for example, there is a crisis, so the company has already planned for this, and they have a nominated crisis room, or a crisis center. So whoever's in charge of that, they'll have somebody with them who is maintaining the log, and that person is keeping a record as things develop. So first thing is to keep the time. Timing is important. Time is going to be synchronized, so you can use the clock on the computer. Most computers have got them, I think, standardized. So work to that clock, and everybody works the same clock doing that. But you maintain the record as you go. The police do this for major investigations. They have an actions log. So the senior officer, the investigating officer, will decide we're going to do this, 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 and this. Then a note is made of that, and then who dealt with that, who did it go to, when did they deal with it, what was the outcome, and that's fed back into the system. We've got a log of what happened. So the records will help managers, as things develop, keep track of what's happening. Have we dealt with that? Oh yes, we have. So and so dealing with it. Have we dealt with it? Oh, we haven't. Right, we need to fix that as well. So put something in place there. Could somebody send that Land Rover with the spare parts? We've forgotten to do that. So keep track of things, things don't get forgotten. And in doing that, it's providing insight into what the decisions have and have not been actioned, and by whom, and with what result. That these logs are, I keep using the word dynamic, that they are. They keep feeding back into each other. They're iterative. You know, you have an action, you get a result, you feed that back into the program. What needs to be done now? Has anything else arisen from that action that needs to be dealt with? But you keep track of it. And then crucially, you support the post-incident analysis. You're going to have one, if you've got any sense, because A, you want to find out what happened. And this is going back to basic deal with human error and risk assessment. It's not the idea to go back to find somebody to blame. It's basic investigation. You want to find out what happened so you can stop it happening again to protect life, protect the company. So you need to prevent reoccurrence. You've got to find out what actually happened. Those logs will tell you what happened. Even if the company doesn't do an analysis, it is quite likely that the regulatory authorities will have an investigation as to what happened. So it's nice to be able to tell them what you did and what you didn't do and why you did it or didn't do it. You've got something to fall back on. This could be months down the line. If there are court cases, I mean, go back to that poor software company. Okay. They've got the government chasing them. They're going to face lawsuits in the civil court for compensation. You know, how did you test your software? They've got a record of it, I hope. You know, we did this, we did that. Who would have realized that would have happened? They can defend themselves. So these records, these logs are crucial in the real time and in the future. They do have a value. Also, call logs. We talked about the call handlers. They should have a standardized call log so they know what they're doing. You can actually get software which will record the messages as they come in. And it's standard practice in the emergency control rooms. Certainly in the ambulance service, we didn't have computers. We tracked the vehicles on paper. But we had two large tape recorders in the corner of the room in a wall rack running simultaneously, recording every emergency call as it came in. So you always had one for checking. If you wanted to check what number somebody had given, you could run the tape back and see what they said. And you had a master log, which was never touched. But in case of a court inquiry or criminal proceedings or whatever, and sometimes the tapes were called in evidence for criminal cases, you've got a record of exactly what was said and who said it. So the software is useful, and that can sometimes will transcribe verbal messages into handwritten ones. I'm not quite certain how good the transcription is, but it's worth looking at. Ultimately, of course, the one benefit of the call logs being handwritten, in fact, all logs being handwritten, is that using paper and a pen is very resilient because you don't need a power supply. So even if you lose power to the control room, as long as you've got a torch, your logbook and a pen, you can keep some idea of what's going on. You don't rely on the computer for everything. So the records, whether handwritten call records, whether logs, should be compiled, standardized. For call logs, as an example, you're looking at the handler's name, so you can go back and double check, you know, do you remember this call? Is that what he said? Do you think that's what happened? The date and the time of the message. So again, using the standardized computer time, so everything works together. Who the message came from with a contact number or call sign or whatever, and who's it going for by name, not just for department, but who, if they asked for a particular person, and who did he send it to? So he asked for maintenance and you sent it to Mr. Whoever. A quick summary of the message, what it's all about. It's not word for word transcription. It's just basically query regarding Land Rover and spare parts. That'll do. And then what did you do? Who did you send it to? Did you send an email? whatever. But that is part of the history of what's going on. So as with the incident logs, all the timing should be correlated. There's a reason for this. If you've got, say, 3 or 4 control rooms running because of different sites, plus you've got all the call logs for the incoming radio and telephone calls, at some point you've got to do this final analysis of what happened. You could take all those individual logs, which are all, each entry has got a time on it. You know that the times are accurate and they are in context with each other because they've all come off the same clock, effectively, off the computer. You could then amalgamate all those records together to form a comprehensive report, a comprehensive log of what happened, a complete timeline from start to finish, second by second, of how the situation developed and how it was handled. And that can be invaluable later on when it comes to analyzing what happened and lessons to be learned from this. So everything has got to be standardized. The call logs, the log books should have a standardized format, make it easier to merge everything together. Okay, it's 20 past 4. Well, for me, it's 20 past 4. I think you're 20 past 7, possibly. So we're getting towards the end. So the time's been limited, and I found this enjoyable to deliver this. It's a topic I quite enjoy. I hope you found this to be of interest and of some value to you. As I say, there are lots of things that we haven't talked about, we've just touched upon, like decision making, like tabletop exercises and how they're done, the value from them, critical decision making. You know, we can leave those for another day, for another webinar if necessary. But if what I've said has somehow struck a chord with you, then if you think you'd like to chat to me about a particular issue or a query or whatever, and you want to do it in confidence rather than over the chat line here, then that's fine. You've got my email address at the bottom. I'm always around. And I'm quite happy to have a free, I stress that, free, informal, introductory discussion about the problem, see where we are, what we can do, how we can help. I mean, I'm happy to do that. And if we can solve it in one quick call, that's fine by me. So that's info@managementsafety.co.uk. It's me. But I say, I hope you've enjoyed this. I've enjoyed writing it and delivering it. So we get to that time. Any questions, please? We've got a few minutes left, deliberately. So how are we doing? I shall speak to those in the background who know about these things, like Cara. How are we doing? Any questions or?
I've got a question, if
Go
you
on, please do.
would bear with me. I think one of the challenges that we find here is that as soon as anything happens, the level of misinformation that seems to start circulating on social media can get completely out of control.
Yes.
And I mean, do you have any kind of, I think, tips for organizations insofar as, you know, how do you maintain that public trust that you are giving, you know, that correct information? Because it's so difficult these days to kind of, you know, especially with social media, things look, you know, that misinformation seems to spread just like wildfire.
Yeah. It's a sad reflection on society. This happens. And I do, in a way, I feel sorry for these trolls who are sending out this misinformation. You know, they must have pathetic little lives if that's what they've got to do. But I think the way the company can react, I don't think you end up getting involved in arguments with them because there are too many of them. I think, and I'm not a media expert, I'm not a media specialist, I never claim to be. But my reaction would be to fight the lies with the truth. So if the company is upfront at the very beginning, yes, we had a problem, We think it's this. We'll let you know as soon as it happens. If they keep the press updated on what's going on, if they keep people updated, regular bulletins and so on, there's less need for people to go and listen to all the rumors and so on and so forth, because they're getting the information, and the fact it's been given as openly as possible would help to build trust. I think where you get a problem, and again, it's a personal view, but I think where people are trying to hide or no comment, oh, well, I can't discuss that, it suggests they've got something to hide. I mean, with a classic example, only about a week or so in the UK, where the new Prime Minister appeared in a photograph published, issued by Downing Street. He's at his desk and he's got a cat on the desk. It's a new kitten, which apparently he bought for his kids because the deal was, if we go to Downing Street, I'll buy you a kitten. Great. Somebody asked Downing Street, how much did it cost? It looks a very, nice looking cat. Where did he get it from? Oh, well, we can't discuss personal matters. Oh, why? It's a perfectly reasonable request. It's not a top secret. It's public knowledge he's got the cat. What's wrong with saying, oh, he bought it himself, or he got it from a neighbor, or his uncle's a cat breeder, or whatever the story was? But by saying no, immediately it starts to engender mistrust. What's he hiding? Oh, big organization. Oh, there's something going on here. And the more they wriggle and say, well, we don't talk about it, no comment, well, we can't discuss that, the more it feeds the fire, rather than simply say, yeah, he bought it himself. What's wrong with that? He
Yeah.
bought it. End of story. I think that's the attitude. That yes, there are things you can't release, and there are things you don't know what's happening, so you can't talk about them. But if the company can give as much information as possible and make it clear, we're not hiding, but there are certain things we don't want to comment on until we've clarified what's going on and it's still fluid. Other things, no, that hasn't happened. No, that's not the case. Sadly, yes, there have been casualties, but we are still trying to establish how many. We think it's in the region of. But as soon as we know, as soon as the families are informed, we'll let you know. It's a matter of your press office building up the relationship with the press, that they've got that trust.
Trust.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good point. I think we've got a couple of comments and maybe one or two questions.
Yeah.
I think Adil had said, how to hold staff accountable for not responding in a crisis. And I think, maybe this comes down when you're expecting certain individuals.
Sorry, I missed that.
How to hold staff accountable
Oh,
for
yes, yeah.
not responding in a crisis. So perhaps, where you are calling on people to do certain actions and they're not stepping up
Yeah.
when getting what they need to get done.
Yeah. I think you have to be careful that you don't drop down into the situation of, oh, well, he's to blame. Blaming people probably doesn't help. What you've got to do is look at it, and it comes back to error management, another topic. You've got to put yourself in their position at the time. What did they know? What was their understanding of the situation? How much training have they had? Was it reasonable to expect this junior level manager who'd been with the company 6 months to suddenly take charge of that? Now, if it's not reasonable, you can't blame him because you didn't do it. If it is a case he was very experienced, he was very trained, then why? Is it just that obviously he couldn't be bothered? Or was it he was basically frightened because he's human and he just couldn't take responsibility because it's outside of his understanding? You've got to dig into it rather than just take it at face value, is what I would say.
Probably. That's why the tabletop exercises and these things are so
Exactly.
and important, so that people understand their roles to play. I think Wissam made a really good point, and he just said something that he's always found very useful, is to study as many crises and diverse environments as possible and see how people adopted different communication strategies, and kind of just enrich yourself with that information, because and I think it's a really good point, and I think we are lucky insofar as a lot of these things do get unpacked post the crises. So there is a lot out there for us to be able to lean on in terms of knowledge. And I think that's a really good suggestion because we don't ever know what the type of crisis is going to be. So
No,
to
no.
look at, various kinds of things that are out there, I think is really important.
Yeah,
Uh,
I would agree with that. Yeah, it's true. I mean, if you're in the oil sector, for example, then you look at incidents from worldwide. Reports are published. Even if you don't read the full report, you just got the summary of it. That gives you an insight into what happened, what went wrong, and it gives you a pointer as to how you should maybe deal with things. So yes, I would fully agree with that.
hmm. And I think Mark mentioned, and I'm hoping I get the acronym right. So he said many here in the Middle East have the need to develop a DEM strategy. Do you have any links or starting points for anyone wanting to get an introduction?
Sorry,
And
DEM.
which I think is disaster emergency management strategy. I I think from a BCM perspective, but Mark, if I've got that wrong, maybe you can just type quickly that I've got it wrong. Let's see. He might say destructive events management.
Destructive events. It's not a phrase I've come across, I must admit. I think the initial thing is to go back to the all-seeing Google and type in DM with them and see what they come up with in terms of supporting materials. There are a lot of organizations that deal with crises, and I think it's maybe look at crises overall. But yeah, DEM is not one I've come up with. I know there are various international groups that deal with crises. And also you'll find local emergency authorities will have their own input as well. But DEM is not something that really help at the moment. It's not one I've looked at in a particular detail.
I
Sorry
mean,
about
I think for us particularly, I think for us, particularly in the Middle East, we do have situations where we do plan for. So it's interesting. So I will give an example of something that used to happen in my previous career is that one of the telco operators that I had in the region, we had actually planned from a business continuity perspective for quite some time around the concept of possibly a bombing that
that.
might take place. And so it was something that we had exercised and repeated quite a number of times within that. And it was quite interesting. And what ended up happening, it wasn't actually a bomb that happened, but we ended up having an oil tanker explosion that happened not so far from our knock, and it actually blew out the windows and some of the knock that we had relatively close by. And it was interesting to see how well prepared that we actually were in that situation. So although we had done so from a different perspective, being involved in perhaps, some type of geopolitical kind of situation that we found ourselves in, it actually put us in excellent stead that when we had the situation where an oil tanker blew, it certainly wasn't, a bomb, it was just an accident that had happened that,
Mm.
affected us. How quickly we were able to respond. The staff will maintain safety. We were able to get our knock up and running as quickly as possible. We were able to board up the windows, and we were, able to get back on our feet. And so I think these are the type of things that we're talking about when we talk about is destructive events management, is that,
Yeah.
we do have these large scale elements that, I do think that companies need to be aware of. And I think, these business continuity management teams have to look at any type of eventuality, whether it's the at times cataclysmic weather events that we can start experiencing now, which is something else that can lead to full-scale destruction
Yes.
for
Yeah.
certain of us in our businesses, whether it's also these other types of, elements that we've got specifically with some of the challenges that we have within the Middle East at the moment and seeing what's taking place. So we do need to be able to prepare for these.
Yes.
And I think that there are some resources out there, and maybe it's something that we can look into, Mark, and I think we can probably circulate something along those lines. I'll drop a few links to those to the participants here, and we can share that. We can share that with the community at large. But yeah, I think that's all we have got the time for today. And Andy, I just want to give you a big thank you. I think,
Oh, my pleasure.
it was really, really great to be able to understand that there's a process that's associated to this. And if there's a
Yeah,
process, we can be good at it and we need to
yeah,
be good at it. And so, we need to make sure that this is not just left to chance. And when these things happen, that we are well prepared, that we've got the process in place. And that does make life a little bit easier, I think, when these things happen. So big thank you to everybody. Thank you for everybody that joined us this evening. And we look forward to seeing everybody again soon.
yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me along. I appreciate it.